You guys ready to talk about Jefferson? Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. So, after the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, we have some amendments that are going to change the way the Constitution functions. That's the purpose of an amendment. One of the first times that happens is with voting for the president and who becomes vice president. That's the 12th Amendment. All right. So originally what would happen is the Electoral College, each member cast 2 votes. And there was no distinction. They didn't say, hey, this is my vote for the president and this is my vote for the vice president. And so if you have everybody casting 2 votes and you're not separating it out between president and vice president, there is the possibility for a tie in the Electoral College, which is exactly what happened with T-Jeff in the election of 1800. So what ends up happening with him is you've got 73 electoral votes for Jefferson and 73 for Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was the intended vice president, but we end up with this deadlock. So the 12th Amendment is going to separate the electoral vote for president and vice president. That's why now we have president and then vice presidential running mate. Okay. The Constitution originally intended for the person with the second most votes to be the vice president because we didn't yet have a bipartisan system. That is actually how we ended up with Thomas Jefferson as John Adams's vice president, right? So we realize that's going to be a really, really terrible idea if we have somebody voting for president and then the intended vice president and we accidentally end up with a tie. So now on to our good friend Thomas Jefferson's presidency. So here we're talking about Jefferson's presidency, but we're not just talking about him. We're talking about a time period known as Jeffersonian democracy. And we are going to separate this between Jeffersonian and then later on Jacksonian, Andrew Jackson, democracy. They are very different ideas about how to interpret the Constitution, how the government should function. We'll talk more about that when we get to the Jackson lecture, because then we'll be able to compare the two. But Thomas Jefferson, in general, he is what I like to call consistently inconsistent. He had a lot of great ideas. He was very idealistic. But he was also known for reversing his convictions a lot. Some people would argue that that's because he was one of those people that when he realized he was wrong, he would change his opinion, something that arguably people could do with doing more of, right? That's a good thing. When you learn something, you're like, hey, my opinion was wrong, let me change it. But some people argue that it was because he had all these beliefs, but he wasn't willing to stick by those beliefs when they were inconvenient for him. So 2 very different looks at Thomas Jefferson. And you can see this not just in his politics, where he reversed a bunch of his political positions, but you can also see it in things like his position on slavery. He was actually supposedly very anti-slave. Remember in the Declaration of Independence, the original version of it, he went on a tirade against Great Britain about propagating this evil slavery, but he owned slaves himself, and he actually had said that he was going to free them after he died, and he didn't. He also had a very notorious affair with a slave who was actually supposedly the half-sister of his wife. So consistently inconsistent is, I think, a great way to describe him. He did, once he became president, displayed unexpected moderation in replacing officials. A lot of people thought that as soon as John Adams was out of office, as soon as T-Jeff was in there, he was just going to throw everybody out. And he didn't do that. He did, though, make a point of undoing Federalist abuses. Remember, we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he does all that he can to combat that. So very quickly after T-Jeff takes office, he has to deal with Federalist abuses of power. Now, I'm not just talking about the alien and sedition laws that we talked about. I'm also talking about some stuff that happens right before Adams leaves office, specifically something that we call the Midnight Appointments. This is a nickname for the Judiciary Act of 1801, and it's passed by Adams just before he leaves office because there's this weird period. It's called the lame duck period that comes between the election, which happens in November, and inauguration, which happens in January. And so the president is not the guy that we elected for a little while. It's the previous president. And so a lot of the time they'll use this period to just kind of coast and not really do much. But John Adams was trying very hard to ensure that as much Federalist power remained as possible. So what he does is this act reorganizes the federal court system and therefore gives him the power to appoint a bunch of federal judges who, by the way, are appointed for life. So Jefferson is going to go hard. As soon, like right out the gate, he's like, no, we're just not going to recognize a bunch of these. This is stupid and it shouldn't have been done. And so one of the offended potential judges is actually going to sue for the delivery of his commission in a landmark Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison. Now, Marbury versus Madison, I would argue, is the most significant Supreme Court case in American history, which is a pretty big claim because there's a lot of huge ones, right? There are a lot of other ones that I could talk about. And if you know anything about Supreme Court cases, you're probably like, what about Brown versus the Board of Education? That one has to do with integrating the school system, and it provides the precedent for integrating the United States in general. Hugely important. Loving v. Virginia is the one that allows for interracial marriage. You've also got Roe versus Wade that has to do with a woman's right to bodily autonomy. All of these are hugely, hugely important, but Marbury versus Madison, even though the court case itself is kind of ridiculous and not super important, it provides the precedent for all of these Supreme Court cases because it establishes something called judicial review. Judicial review is the idea that it's the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court alone who can determine constitutionality. And so all of these later Supreme Court cases, Roe versus Wade, Brown versus the Board of Education, the 2015 ruling that legalizes gay marriage, like all of these rulings have to do with constitutionality and constitutional rights, right? And that was established through judicial review, the idea that that was the Supreme Court's job. All right, so remember that time I told you guys that Jefferson was consistently inconsistent, right? This is a great example. When we talked about Jefferson and Hamilton, and my dog is very done with me doing this lecture right now. I don't know if you guys can hear him, but he is huffing. It's okay, Baxter. We'll be done soon. So we talked about Hamilton and Jefferson and the formation of the first political parties. And remember, Jefferson was a strict constructionist, which meant that he thought if the Constitution didn't say that you could do something, you couldn't do it. He reverses that position pretty quickly when Louisiana comes along. So what happened was Napoleon withdrew the U.S. right of deposit at New Orleans. So to help you understand why that's important, New Orleans is down here-ish, and it's super, super important to the United States because that's how we get anything that's around here. That's how we get it to where it needs to go if we're sending it overseas, because that's a lot quicker than taking it this way, all right? So we need that right of deposit. Jefferson is going to send a dude named Robert Livingston to buy the city for $10 million. Now he's going to justify this through the supremacy clause. All right, he's going to say my stance My strict construction views say that this is okay because of the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause gives the federal government the right to regulate trade and commerce. He says this purchase has to do with regulating trade and commerce. It ends up being Jefferson's first major compromise of his beliefs, though, because Napoleon is going to say, hey, I will not be selling you New Orleans, but if you give me $15 million, I will give you all of Louisiana. Now, big deal about Louisiana. It is not just the state of Louisiana at this time. Louisiana is all this area right here. All right. It is going to, at the time, double the size of the United States, because at this point in time, we have the green. All right. Doubles it. This ends up being the most important land purchase in U.S. history. Later on, Lewis and Clark are going to be sent to find an all-water route to the Pacific. They're supposed to see if they can go this way to get our stuff where it needs to go. Because, like I said, if we're like right here, we're going down to New Orleans. That's because of the Mississippi River. We can send stuff down the river instead of traveling over land. We want to see if we can do that to the west. We can't. Spoiler. But their journey was super, super important. They found lots of new flora and fauna, which is plants and animals. They also did a lot of talking with Native American groups. There was some tension there, but they had Sacagawea with them. She was an interpreter. She was a Native American. She actually made the whole journey with her newborn baby. So, pretty gangster. And so they're going to go all the way to the west. They don't find what they were looking for, but they do explore the territory. After exploring and charting and stuff like that, people are a little bit more willing to go and move into the Louisiana territory. All right, so I want you guys to watch this video. I want you guys to watch this video before you continue with this lecture. But this has to do with my good friend Alexander Hamilton and Burr. Aaron Burr. All right, so Burr, remember, is vice president right now. This is going to give you a little bit of background. It's actually from the Hamilton musical. It's wonderful. It's a rap. So, like, right there, the historical rap, it's got to be good, right? All right, so now that you've watched that, theoretically, I want to talk a little bit about the death of Alexander Hamilton. All right, so Alexander Hamilton, remember, he never got to be president, but he was in charge of the Federalists. So he was the guy in charge. He was the guy who was kind of the driving force. He was the creator, the founder. His death is going to be one of the big nails in the coffin for the Federalists. Because remember, after John Adams, they're never going to have another Federalist president. Hamilton and this guy, Aaron Burr, they were longtime rivals. They had actually been friends during the American Revolution, that sort of period, but they always really disagreed on how to do things, how to get things done. Hamilton thought that Burr didn't really stand for anything. Burr was one of those guys, he was like, look, if you keep your mouth shut and nobody really knows where you stand, then you have more options. He was that kind of dude, right? But he also was one of those guys that ran his mouth behind other people's backs. And so they had kind of a back and forth behind each other's backs. Hamilton, though, Hamilton did a lot of talking, and a lot of that got back to Burr. So Burr had reportedly joined an extremist plot for New England to secede from the Union, which is huge. And he was also vice president at the time, so that made things pretty awkward. Hamilton started talking, and he exposed him. Burr is going to retaliate with a challenge to a duel. Now, historically, we don't know because Burr was a behind-your-back kind of guy, so he was pretty close-lipped as far as like public statements. We're not really sure if it was because of the plot, if there were other issues, or if Hamilton provoked him on purpose, which is very possible because he was Alexander Hamilton. But what ends up happening is Burr wins the duel. Now, some people say this is because Hamilton shot into the air instead of shooting at Burr. That was something that was fairly commonplace at the time. Duels were a way to satisfy a slight and to clear things up. So sometimes they wouldn't actually shoot to kill. So there's that allegedly going on. Either way, though, Hamilton is dead. And Burr doesn't go to jail because even though duels were technically illegal at the time, most of the time they were just kind of ignored because they were consensual. It's consensual murder, so it's fine. Later on, though, he goes even more extreme. He allies with a general to hatch another secession plot. Apparently, he did not like the way things were going in the United States, but he was betrayed by that general. He was arrested for treason, and he was let off on a technicality. That technicality is that he committed conspiracy to commit treason, like he was trying to do something treasonous, but he didn't actually do it. The general turned on him too soon. So he's gonna kind of go to Europe for a while, let things settle. The best part, though, you guys, the thing that I think is hilarious, you might not because it's history and I have a lot of feelings about it, you might not, but later on, Aaron Burr was divorcing his wife. He had come back to the Americas. He was divorcing his wife, and his wife's lawyer was Alexander Hamilton Jr. Imagine the guy that you shot in a duel, his son is the lawyer for your soon-to-be ex-wife. And all of the stress and everything, by the end of it, before the divorce was actually finalized, Burr is going to drop dead. All right, so remember, I told you we're not just talking about Thomas Jefferson. We're talking about Jeffersonian democracy. So we're also going to cover a couple other guys. This guy, James Madison, was elected in 1808 after Thomas Jefferson served his couple of terms, and he was the third in line of 4 presidents from Virginia. So it was Washington, Adams wasn't one, Jefferson, Madison, and then after him, Monroe. This is going to become known as the Virginia dynasty. And it's going to kind of freak people out. They're going to worry that because of where we've located our center of power, that we're just gonna set ourselves up to only have presidents from Virginia. Now, during his presidency, we're going to see a lot of tension, and we're going to end up going to war. The war is the War of 1812. And we're going to talk about that very briefly. But really, the War of 1812, the thing that was important about it was the ending. So we're not going to talk about the actual war itself too terribly much. We will, though, talk about how it started. And so a lot of that is going to have to do with tension that the United States is feeling with other countries. So the Napoleonic Wars were going on. Remember, I told you guys about Napoleon. He was the emperor in France. Well, he kind of tried to, and we talked about this a little bit with the French Revolution, he tried to kind of start a whole entire world war because he tried to take over the world, which is very rude, shouldn't do it. And so those wars, specifically between the British and the French, are going to lead to the harassment of U.S. shipping. So we try really hard not to get involved, but we can't really help it because they're involving us. For example, something happens called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. This is something that happens on the water. The Chesapeake is an American vessel. The Leopard is a British vessel. So they're American and British ships. And the Leopard is going to demand the surrender of 4 supposed British deserters. Now, remember we talked about impressment? Remember way back to Jay's Treaty? Well, that is what the men who are the supposed deserters are going to say happened to them. So they're going to say, we're not British deserters, we're American, and they're trying to take us back. They kidnapped us into service in the first place. And so obviously the Chesapeake is going to refuse, and the Leopard fires on them. There's a bunch of other stuff happening where Britain and France are both kind of messing with our shipping. This one is kind of the tipping point. And so we decide we're going to punish both France and Britain. But when we try to punish them, we don't go about it so great. We pass the Embargo Act of 1807. The Embargo Act forbids export of all goods from the United States to any destination. Well, that's super problematic. Now we can't send things anywhere, not just France and Britain. We're really just punishing ourselves. So we tried to fix this a couple years later with the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 by just forbidding exports to France and Britain. The problem is we waited too long, we passed this first law, and it doesn't go too well for us. We're also going to see, though, in addition to tension with other countries, like we have here, having issues with these guys, especially the British and the French, but we have issues with other countries. That was supposed to be an arrow. That was just a hot mess instead, but pretend. We're also going to have issues with Native Americans. There's going to be a ton of tension between us and natives on the frontier. Specifically, we're going to see a resistance movement come about with these two guys, Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh. They're brothers, and Tecumseh is kind of the military guy, but Tenskwatawa is the one that starts everything. He is known as the Prophet. And you're actually going to see this a lot throughout American history. Anytime Native Americans feel kind of backed into a corner, you'll see a religious revitalization movement where a prophet comes and is like, this is how we get rid of the white people. And so that's what happens with Tenskwatawa. He was actually a super raging drunk, and he gets drunk one night. He falls face first into a fire. He pokes his own eye out with a hot stick, like one that is literally on fire. The only reason he survives is because since it's on fire, it immediately cauterizes the wound. After that, he's going to fall into this deep sleep that is, it's a coma, you guys. Let's not call it anything else. It's a coma, but it's also considered by the Native Americans to be a spirit dream. Now, I don't want to say that it wasn't a spirit dream. Very well could have been, but it did definitely resemble a coma. And so he falls into this, And he has this dream about how to end Western influence in Native America. And so him and Tecumseh, his brother, they kind of join together. They form this place called Prophetstown, because remember, he's the prophet. And this is going to be the first really big bid for inter-native group cooperation. But unfortunately, it's kind of too little too late. If Native Americans had done this before the United States got so powerful, before Britain got so powerful in the Americas, it might have had an impact. But by this point in time, you remember we talked way long ago about the Columbian Exchange. These guys have far, far fewer numbers than Native America initially did. So they start working together. Things are actually going fairly well, though. Tecumseh is a great strategist. Tenskwatawa, though, he gets kind of jealous that Tecumseh is getting so much of the attention, because it was Tenskwatawa that had the spirit dream. And so when his brother goes off on a recruitment sort of mission, he's basically like, Tenskwatawa, you're in charge, don't touch anything. And instead, Tenskwatawa leads natives into the Battle of Tippecanoe. And that is a huge loss for Prophetstown. And that's going to highlight a lot of the issues between the United States and native groups, which is going to be important in the War of 1812, because whereas in the French-Indian War, the natives are siding with the French because the British were the ones in power and they didn't like the way things were going. In the War of 1812, you'll see most Native American groups side with the British over the Americans. You're also going to have a group called Warhawks. They wanted to conquer Canada. Southern expansionists also are going to want Spanish Florida. So these guys, they want war so that we can expand our boundaries. And the British, obviously, because of the Chesapeake Leopard affair and all that, they're still impressing sailors. So we're not happy with Britain at all. So the War of 1812 itself is a relatively small war. Only about 6,000 Americans are killed or wounded, and we're actually going to fight mostly Canadians, because Canada at this point is a colony of Britain. The British soldiers have other things to do, because remember, the Napoleonic Wars are still going on. The United States itself was very, very militarily unprepared. We are going to attack Canada. That's going to fail. The British are going to get in and burn down Washington, D.C. We're not doing so hot there. And it's because we led with our tension rather than what we were actually prepared to do. We were like, we're very angry. Let's have a war. And we maybe shouldn't have had a war. There are a couple of important battles. The Battle of Fort McHenry is an important British loss. This is where the Star-Spangled Banner is written. There's also the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. This is the largest Indian massacre in U.S. history. This was Native Americans who were fighting with the British, getting just absolutely decimated. And then you've got the Battle of New Orleans. The funny thing about the Battle of New Orleans is we consider it a battle from the War of 1812, but it actually occurred after the war was officially over. It's an overwhelming victory for the United States, but it doesn't really impact the course of the war. But Americans think it does, and that's what's important. Andrew Jackson is going to be the guy credited with this victory, and that is actually going to lead him later on to the presidency. Now, the Treaty of Ghent is going to end the war. It ends in a stalemate, so nobody wins. Any conquered territories are all going to be restored. There's no mention of pre-war grievances, you guys. We are really good at doing that with Britain. We just don't talk about it until there's a war. America is, though, going to gain diplomatic and military respect. That is the big thing that we get from the War of 1812, which has also been called the Second War for Independence. Why? Because at this point in time, we weren't really seen as powerful in our own right. We were still kind of mocked by European countries, and this shows that we can hold our own. Now, granted, we were mostly fighting Canadians, and things didn't go well, and we didn't even really win, but it's a big morale boost for us, and it gets us recognition on the world stage. America gains that respect. Indians, though, are going to lose a lot of territory. Pretty much any war in American history, Native Americans lose. No matter what side they fight on, they kind of end up being screwed over. And it's awful, but that's just how history happened. Even when they side with the winners, they get lumped in together and we take their territory. The United States, though, another thing that's going to happen, which is kind of nicely ironic, is United States industry is going to be stimulated by less reliance on British goods. So we're going to see the Industrial Revolution come to America. The reason it's a little bit ironic is because this war is led by Jeffersonians. It's led by the Democratic Republicans, and it's the Democratic Republicans who didn't really like industry. They liked small farmers. And so they kind of inadvertently spark the Industrial Revolution, which is something that they didn't want to happen. Another thing that's going to happen during this period is something called the Hartford Convention. You remember the Federalists? They're about to go away completely. Now, yes, things got bad after Alexander Hamilton died, but they still existed. Well, they're actually going to have a meeting during the War of 1812 because we love meetings, and it ends up being their death blow. They wanted financial assistance from the government. They discussed a bunch of anti-war complaints. They recommended a bunch of amendments. Now, these amendments, a lot of them were actually kind of good ideas. The problem is, though, there was a minority of them urging secession, and even those that weren't, they were very anti-war. And once we get to the Battle of New Orleans, we are all very proud to be an American. We are all very excited about this war that Americans think that we won. And so these guys, they couldn't have had worse timing. And so after this, we're going to see a period that we call the era of good feelings. Now, the era of good feelings is going to have a lot of good feelings on the surface. That is a huge, huge trend in American history. You'll have peace and prosperity on the surface. It'll look like there's lots of money, there's lots of wealth, things are going great, but under the surface, things are kind of bubbling over. So we have a lot of tranquility and prosperity. James Monroe becomes president. Everybody loves him and his beautiful butt chin. There's lots of nationalism and patriotism. Everybody, like I said, they're proud to be an American after the War of 1812. We're also going to see the emergence of the second generation of U.S. leaders. And this is hugely important, you guys, because before this point in time, the people who are leading us, James Madison was considered the father of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. John Adams is one of the guys that was fighting in the American Revolution. George Washington was the hero of the American Revolution. He was in charge of the military. These guys were all around at a time when the United States didn't exist. The second generation of U.S. leaders are going to have a different conception of America because they were born after the United States became a thing. We're also going to see a lot of improved industry and transportation, but under the surface, we have a lot of bad stuff going on. We have sectionalism and slavery. This is going to characterize the rest of U.S. history, all right? All the way to the end of this class, to the Civil War, slavery is the hot button issue. We're also going to see some arguments over the tariff and internal improvements. One big thing, though, that's going to happen during the War of 1812, the Bank of the United States, its charter runs out. When this charter runs out, remember, the Democratic Republicans didn't like the Bank of the United States. So they just don't do anything about it. They let it run out, and then we don't have a bank. That is problematic. We needed one of those, and we figured that out pretty soon. So as a result of us not having that Bank of the United States for a while and some other things, we're going to see our first major financial panic, which is the Panic of 1819. We'll talk about that in a minute. Talk about this group of guys. They are nicknamed the Great Triumvirate. Now, it sounds like they are three guys that work really well together, but actually, they don't like each other at all. So there's the three dudes. There's Calhoun. He's from the South. We've got Daniel Webster. He's from the North. And we have Henry Clay, who is from the West. So we have somebody from, it's John C. Calhoun. I don't know why I just called him Calhoun. That's his whole name. So we have these three guys from the three major regions of the United States. And they are going to be the three most powerful men in Congress. And they're pretty much going to run things for a while. Henry Clay is especially important among those guys. He's actually going to be known as the Great Compromiser. He is responsible for three major compromises, and we'll see that in just a few minutes. But one thing that he's also going to do is he's going to create something called the American system. The American system is it's kind of like, you remember Hamilton's financial plan? It's kind of like that. It's supposed to help our economy. There are three major aspects of it. He is going to create the Second National Bank, which is supported by the Jeffersonians, by the Democratic Republicans, which is insane because remember they thought that we shouldn't have one. He's also going to help pass the Tariff of 1816. This becomes the first protective tariff in United States history. And he's going to fight for internal improvements, which would have given money to states for infrastructure, but it failed to pass. These two major things, though, the Second National Bank and the Tariff of 1816, have a huge impact on the United States, as does the Panic of 1819. All right, so this guy right here, you may know him, you may not. He's Brendan Urie from Panic at the Disco. So anytime there's a financial panic, Brendan Urie likes to pop up. So the Panic of 1819 itself was caused by over-speculation on frontier land by banks. So basically they're giving too much money in loans for the land that's in the West. There's also, though, a lot of inflation from the War of 1812 and the post-war drop-off. The biggest thing, though, is that inflation from the War of 1812 is exacerbated by not having a national bank. Okay, the Panic of 1819 is largely caused by that. And so what you usually see when we have a financial panic is people like a physical, tangible thing to argue about, and they like to place blame. All right, we have to have something that we can argue about, somebody whose fault things are. And so we're going to see the American perspective shift from this panic that's also causing a financial depression, and we're going to start talking about slavery. Specifically, we're going to see the Talmadge Amendment be proposed, and it said that no more slaves would be allowed to be brought into the Missouri Territory after Missouri applied for statehood. This is going to lead to the South absolutely losing their minds, you guys. It's going to lead to Southern fears about the future of the slave system, and the Senate ends up refusing to pass it. But as a result, we have a whole lot of tension going on regarding the slave system. And so we're going to see Henry Clay's first major compromise. All right, so Henry Clay is going to be like, guys, the North has some points, the South has some points, but ultimately we have to all be friends. Because remember, Henry Clay is from the West. And so he comes up with this idea. Missouri would be admitted to the United States as a slave state, but at the same time, we would admit Maine as a free state. What this is going to do is it's going to keep sectional balance, and that is going to set a precedent for almost all the way until the Civil War, Anytime we admit one, we'll admit the other. We'll keep the balance. It also prohibits future slavery above this line. We call it the Missouri Compromise line. It's the 3630 line, the latitudinal line, right? Now, slavery does exist above it, right here, but it's for the future. Now, here's the problem. The Missouri Compromise says there can be no more slavery above this line, okay? So any of this stuff can't be slave. This stuff, though, it doesn't say it has to be slave. That's going to be hugely important later on. We're going to have some big fights about it. But for now, Henry Clay has kept the peace. We have kept a civil war from happening, right? But there are going to be some things going on right about now, some issues. There's another treaty that's going to happen. Now, remember, we saw the Pinckney Treaty with Spain, and they gave part of Florida to the United States, but mostly it just kind of smooths things over. We're also going to see during this time, though, the Adams-Onis Treaty. There are a bunch of revolutions happening in South America. Spain ends up having to move troops from Florida so that they can try to keep their colonies. And Andrew Jackson is going to take advantage of this. He's going to begin the First Seminole War. Now, Jackson at this point, he's a general. He goes down into Florida where technically we're not supposed to be fighting, but there's no Spanish, well, not a lot of Spanish troops to keep him out, and he's going to fight Native Americans. The big takeaway from this, it's bloody, it kills a ton of Seminoles, and all of that is terrible, but the big takeaway for American history is that Spain is going to give us Florida. They also give up claims to Oregon in exchange for the United States giving up any claim to Texas. Now, you guys might be thinking, obviously the United States has some claim to Texas because Texas is a state. Don't worry, we're going to be real shady about that later and we'll talk about it. But for right now, that's what we do, all right? We're also, though, going to start getting involved. Here comes Baxter, you guys. He's done with me recording. We're also, though, going to see the passage of something called the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine really has to do with the Adams-Onis Treaty because we have all of those revolutions happening in South America. And we want to make sure that after those revolutions are won, after you have these colonies becoming independent, we want to make sure that Europe doesn't come back in, the British, the French, whoever. We want to make sure they don't come back in and take over these brand new little baby countries. And so this is written by John Quincy Adams to say that the United States would become involved in Latin and South America to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. Essentially, it said imperial powers could keep their existing colonies, but they couldn't have new ones. And if they lost a colony in a revolution, they had to let that Latin American republic govern itself. All right, so I will see you guys next time when we talk about my very least favorite president, Andrew Jackson. I'll tell you all about all of the feelings that I have for him when I see you again.